Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm looking at all of our group chat boxes, and I see people joining us from all over the world, and then certainly in the United States, East Coast to West Coast. So I'm super excited to have you join us today for our very first Summer of Learning webinar for 2018. Welcome. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers, I'd like to welcome you to joining this great conversation today on Rigor is not a four-letter word. Without further ado, what I'd really like to do is go ahead and introduce our speaker of the hour. We have Dr. Barbara Blackburn, who is an author of 18 books, including the bestseller Rigor is not a four-letter word. She presents at international, national, and state conferences, as well as collaborating with school districts on professional development. We're very thrilled to have her join us today for our Share My Lesson Summer of Learning series. Welcome, Barbara.
Oh, thank you very much. I am so excited to be here, and I want to thank everyone for giving up your time to come spend it with me today. I am very excited because I love rigor. It is probably my favorite topic, and that really surprises people because rigor in many cases has a very negative connotation. And so I want you to know that my goal is by the end of our time together that you will like rigor better. That's a real fluffy goal, but that's a goal of mine. I want you to feel like you understand it better in terms of what it really means. And I hope you're going to find a couple of classroom activities you can take back immediately. And I noticed in the group chat, a lot of you were saying you wanted some activities, and we are going to get there. My challenge is that we need to all have a good base of understanding before we can get to that. So we'll be doing that. And let's start just with looking at a question. So you're just going to answer this in the group chat. How would you describe rigor? If you were going to use a word or a phrase, what would you say to describe the concept of rigor? And so we're just going to put those in the group chat. Okay, working. Oh, lots of people with challenge. Love that. Difficulty. Donna, students really feel that way. Lots of you with difficulty. Complexity, getting them out of their comfort zone, higher thinking. Yeah, I mean, these are great answers. Somebody talked about Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to talk specifically about that a little bit later. Thought-provoking, I love that phrase. The idea that we're preparing them for the challenges of today's world. It's interesting. My dad, who was a teacher and a coach and a college professor, told me one time that he had a really interesting definition of what the purpose of education was. And so I was like, oh, what's that, Dad? And he said, you know, the purpose of education is teaching students what to do when they don't know what to do. And I thought that was so cool. And so that's some of what y'all are saying. All right, I know we've still got some responses coming in, but I want to go ahead and jump into some content. Hopefully you've been able to download the PowerPoint or the handouts. If not, check with them in technical support, and they'll make sure you can do that. But let's start with what rigor is. Again, more than it's hard, more than it's difficult, more than I'm going to double the amount of work. Parents perceive rigor as more homework. None of that is true. So what we're really looking at with rigor is creating an overall classroom environment in which each student is expected to learn at high levels. Each student is supported so he or she can learn at high levels. And each student demonstrates learning at high levels. And by the way, y'all are just hearing me, not seeing me, which is good since my little kitty cat is jumping all over the back of my chair. So for those of you asking that question. All right, so let's go back to the definition. There's 4 parts of it that we're going to be getting into. The environment, what does a classroom environment look like? Expectations, what are high expectations? What is the role of support? And what is the role of assessment or demonstrating learning at high levels? And so we're going to go into each of these. But before we jump in anymore, I want you to give me a little bit more information. Which aspect of those 4 aspects of rigor do you feel like is the strongest in your classroom or in your school? And so you're just going to click on the poll here instead of the chat to submit that. And remember, those of you getting credit, you definitely want to click into the polls. And you're going to have my PowerPoint. You've got all of the information in my handouts too, so, you know, don't feel like you got to write everything down. Okay, so we are looking at the poll. Do you feel like your classroom environment really supports rigor? Do you feel like you have high expectations for all of your students? Do you feel like you give them the appropriate support and scaffolding to be successful? Do you feel like your assessment, how students demonstrate learning, is challenging enough? Let's take just a few more seconds on that. And, you know, it's hard because people always want to know which one's the most important. They're all important. I think that that's, again, one of the things that is a misconception with rigor is as long as our expectations are high, then that's good enough. So let's see what our poll results look like. Okay, expectations, support, and scaffolding. Both of those are up really, really high. Okay, so I want you to sort of keep in mind what you said, and we're going to go through these, and I want you to see how your version of what that looks like matches up with mine. So let's start with the environment. It's real interesting because most teachers will stop me when I'm doing face-to-face. They'll stop me and say, you know, wait a minute, we have challenging standards. Isn't that enough? And, you know, challenging standards are great, but I don't know about y'all, but in my school where I taught, I saw teachers who had challenging standards, and, boy, they taught those in a very low-level way. So the standards alone really are not enough. So what we're looking at is that overall piece that's going to work with the standards. So the environment sort of encompasses everything else we're going to be talking about. What I found is that if you want students to work at rigorous levels, you do have to have that classroom environment that helps them do that. Just like in your school, if you've got a supportive administrator and supportive colleagues you work with, you are more willing to take risks. Okay, so that's going to be true of the environment with students. So let's look at the 4 parts of a rigorous environment. The first one is that it should be motivating. Now, you may be thinking right now, that sounds great, but I have students who are not motivated, and you're probably thinking of one. You're going, no matter what I did, they were not motivated last year. Here's the thing. I have found that all students are motivated. They're just not motivated by what we want them to be motivated by, and that's very different. And so one of the things we have to do if we want students to work at rigorous levels is we have to tap in to their motivation. And now not all of this is in your handout, so if you want to take notes, you know, take a little bit here. I found that when it comes to motivation, students are intrinsically motivated by 2 things, value and success. They are more motivated when they see value in what they are doing. They are more motivated when they feel successful. Now, value can be relevance, but value can also be activities. I find that students are more motivated when they are doing active learning versus passive learning. So they can be motivated by the relevance. They can also be motivated by the activity. They also can be motivated by their relationship with you in terms of value. Now, those are examples. Bridget just asked a good question. Those are really talking about intrinsic motivation. So what about extrinsic motivation? Is that better? Very mixed research. A lot of folks are very negative about extrinsic motivation. A lot of folks are very positive about the use of praise and rewards. They're pretty much all over the spectrum. I will tell you that I fall in the middle. I found with my students, particularly my struggling students, that I tended to need to use some extrinsic motivators to get them started in particular. They liked stickers. They did. They liked a library pass. So I used them. What you have to be careful of with extrinsic motivation is that it can become sort of a monster. Kids begin to expect it all the time. They want the stakes to continue to be increased. And so that's why I tend to talk about intrinsic motivation, because extrinsic really is, short term. You can get them started, but you're probably not going to keep them going long. Think of it like caffeine. It gives them a boost, but then it, sort of falls apart. So you do want that motivation. So you want to try to tap in to their value, but also their success. And we're going to talk about support later, but your students need to feel successful. Now, we're going to finish with environment. Then we're going to go to expectations. Several of you have questions related to that. I promise we're going to get there. Okay, student ownership. You want the, two intrinsic motivations, value and success. I love it when y'all ask me the questions right on time so we can get to it quickly. Okay, student ownership. You want them to share in the ownership of your classroom. You want them to be actively involved. Safety and security, very important. With Rigor, you are asking students to take a risk, and they are going to be afraid they are going to fail, and they need to feel safe that they can do that. And I will tell you that my experience with teachers is the ones who struggle the most with that are gifted students, because they want to be perfect and they don't like making mistakes. And so we have to create an environment where they can feel safe doing that. Then the last one is progress and achievement. In our schools today, we do a great job of focusing on achievement, particularly with test scores. But in a rigorous classroom, you also want to focus on progress, because rigor for many students is a big goal. And so what we have to do is celebrate those small steps so they feel successful. So that's what you're looking at for an environment. Okay? Now, let's jump over to expectations, because you've got a lot of questions here. We have always known that our expectations are important. Okay? That's not a surprise. If we expect students to do a lot, then they will try. If we expect that they cannot do something, they will prove us right. So what we have to do is have high expectations that, and several of you mentioned this, that are also reasonable, because it's like, okay, I can have high expectations for everybody, but then what? And so what you've really got to do with your expectations is find a way to keep them high, but allow students to achieve them even if that looks differently. And that's where your differentiation comes in. Just last week, my book, Rigor and Differentiation in the Classroom, came out. And I want to give you an example from that, because it works really well. Okay? Let's take math. Okay? In most math classrooms, we do computational math. Okay? And then to increase the rigor is we give them a word problem. And I'll ask teachers, okay, so that can or cannot be rigorous. For example, if my computation is 2 plus 2 equals 4, and my word problem is Sally has 2 pieces of pizza and Joaquin has 2 pieces of pizza, how many total do they have? They've just done the computation with words around it. So that's really a low-level activity. So then I'll have teachers say, well, I'm going to have students write their own word problems. That's going to be, they're creating. That's Bloom's taxonomy. Well, you know what? If they write Libby has 2 pieces of pizza, and Barbara has 2 pieces of pizza. How many pieces do they have total? They're still doing that basic level work. So creation, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, can be a little iffy. So the reality is that in a math classroom, a higher level of expectation is for students to understand the content well enough to be able to recognize misconceptions, explain them, and correct them. So what I would want to do after students have learned how to do addition, I would want to give them 3 sample problems. And they would be 3 addition problems, and I would tell them 1 is not correct. And they have to figure out which one is incorrect, which one is a misconception, solve it correctly, and explain why it was incorrect. So that's a much more rigorous piece. Now, let's talk about that, because you may be going, okay, I got students who can't do that. Because that example works in calculus, it works with anything. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I want my expectation to be high. I want students to understand the content well enough to recognize, explain misconceptions, solve them correctly. That's my high expectation. Here's what I'm going to do with different students. Some of my students, I'm going to give them 2 examples of computations, and they have to figure out which one is not correct. Some of them, I may give them 3. I may do 4 and not tell them how many are incorrect, so they have to figure that out. So I can make all of those adjustments just within computation. Now, I can then move to word problems and do the same thing. I can give them 2, I can give them 4, I can tell them how many mistakes, and I love what Lori just said, it's the error analysis. You know, practicing that error analysis helps them with this. But does that make sense? Because several of you have talked about this, you know, how do you know? And are they rigorous? That's a rigorous expectation that all of your students, even in a modified classroom, even in a kindergarten classroom, all of your students can do. And you just have to support them to get there. You don't throw them into it by themselves. You've practiced it, and you help them get there. So hopefully that helps you with that balance, because that's also true for the demonstrating of learning with assessment. But I like the math one because it's a very concrete example. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about expectations, though, because sometimes expectations are your actions and your language. So, for example, Robert Marzano and some other folks have looked at how do we act if we have different expectations. And what they found is that we do treat students differently if our expectations are high and low. So, for example, I've got 2 students in my class. I've got Tomas. Boy, he is sharp. Straight A student, always does his homework, first one to raise his hand in class. I mean, just really great. Then I've got Libby, who, you know, Libby's just sort of there. She hangs in there, never raises her hand, you know, doesn't turn in her homework. I mean, she's just sort of with us. And I may start the year with high expectations for both, but what happens is, over time, my expectations for Tomas go up, and my expectations for Libby go down, just because of what I'm seeing. And I don't even mean for it to happen, okay? It just sort of happens. So what Marzano found was then we began to treat them differently. With Tomas, I will stand closer to him. I will give him more eye contact. I will give him more praise. I will give him more wait time. I will ask him higher order questions, and I don't do those things with Libby. Now, it's okay to differentiate your questions, but you still got to keep those expectations high, which means if I ask Tomas, you know, what is the theme of the story, and give me your justification for it, with Libby, I may still say, what is the color of the dog? But I'm going to say, how do you know? Give me a specific example. So with both, I'm expecting justification. And what Marzano found was we don't do that. We'll just ask Libby what color is the dog? Okay? And so what happens is, over time, those students see how we're treating them differently. And Libby just goes down and down and down. And I will tell you, I made that mistake, and I did not even realize I was doing it. I'm going to tell you about my worst mistake as a teacher. And the good news is I've told this enough. I don't get just terribly embarrassed every time, because it's a pretty bad mistake. At the time I was teaching 7th grade, I had taught elementary. I taught a little bit of everything, kindergarten through 9th grade, pre-kindergarten through 9th grade. But I was teaching 7th grade, and I was teaching remedial students. And a few days before the school year started, we had just gotten our class rolls. And what I remember, I taught in a school had about 1,250 kids. 21 of my fellow teachers came by my classroom individually, and each one said the same thing. They said, I've heard you got Patrick this year. I'm going to be praying for you. Now, here's the thing. I don't really care how you feel about prayer. 21 teachers praying for you about a student you've never met is just not a good sign for the year. It just really isn't. And sure enough, when he came in, he lived up to that reputation. 6 foot tall, from the hood. His job in life is to make me miserable, and he did. And at the end of the year, I gave him a D. Remember, I told you it was a mistake. Gave him a D. He earned an F. But I taught the remedial students. So if he failed, I would have him again the next year. And I don't know about y'all, but I felt like I had done my time, and it was time for somebody else. So I gave him a D. And my summer job was teaching 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds how to swim. So I have to go do little kids that are just fun in the summer. So I did that, come back the next year, and I'm really excited. It's going to be a good year, not going to be as bad because I don't have Patrick. Well, I walked in the door, ran into my principal, and he said, oh, Miss Blackburn, I meant to call you this summer, but I really knew you wouldn't care. Ms. Wilson has changed schools, so I've moved you to 8th grade. And some of you are already grinning because you know what happened. I got Patrick again. And yes, I did. And the year started off just like it had ended. Awful, awful, awful. So about, I don't know, a few days into the school year, I decided I wasn't going to do that again this year. So I pulled him in at lunch. He comes in. He sort of sprawls down, just legs spread everywhere. And I said, Patrick, do you know why you're here today? Nope. Hadn't done anything yet being the operative word. And I said, well, Patrick, we had a bad year last year. Oh, you got that right, Miss Blackburn. And he was not an angel. Don't be thinking that. And I said, well, we partly had a bad year because I had heard some things about you. And he perked up with that because he liked the idea he had a reputation. And so he was like, really? And I said, yeah. And so, Patrick, there were things I didn't do last year to help you learn. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start over with a fresh start. And we're going to do a clean slate. We're going to forget last year ever happened. And here's what I know. You are going to make a B in my classroom, at least a B. And I'm going to do everything it takes to help you get there, and you are going to do your part. And he left my room totally confused because he'd never heard a teacher talk about that. Now, I will tell you it took me 6 weeks to convince him I was serious. During those 6 weeks, when I called on students, I called on him even if he didn't raise his hand. And when he didn't know the answer, I stuck with him and guided him to the answer. I didn't let it go. When we had small groups, put him in charge of a small group with specific responsibilities. When he was leading the class at the end of the day, I'd say, Patrick, you got everything you need? And he said, yep, which meant nope. So I'd give him another copy of his homework. He'd come in the next day, and I'd say, Patrick, you got everything you need for class? And he'd say, yep. And I knew that meant that he didn't have a pencil because his excuse for not doing the work was not having a pencil. And he liked it if that was a discipline infraction because ultimately he'd be sent to the office. So what I did was I would loan him my pencil. Now, mine were 3 feet long, bright pink with feathers on the end. And some of you are going, my kids would like that. But Patrick was an 8th grader who was 6 feet tall from the hood. He did not. And after about 6 weeks, he shaped up. And at the end of the year, he earned a B. Now, let me tell you why it's the biggest mistake. I wasted a year of his life. I wasted it. And I will have teachers come up to the workshop and say, well, now, Barbara, he did his part. You know, he could have done this, this. You know what? I get that. But here's the deal. It was my job, and I didn't do it. And worse than that, I listened to 21 teachers who told me he was a bad kid. And so when it comes to our expectations, the language, what we say and hear about students, drives our actions, and all of those things reflect our expectations. So, you know, rigorous standard or not, if you've got that low expectation for that student, they're not going to achieve. So it's all about saying, I believe every student can achieve, and I'm going to help them get there. It's not just about them. All right, let's look at the next piece, which is support and scaffolding. And I know a lot of you said you feel real good about your support and scaffolding, and that's great. You know, I do find that the higher the level of rigor, the higher the need for scaffolding. And I do run into teachers sometimes who say, you know what, part of rigor is students learning to do it on their own. Okay, yes, ultimately they need to, but they need support to get there. And so here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about your first year as a teacher, or if you're a principal, the first year as a principal. Okay, first year. How many of you needed help? Okay, just think in your head. How many of you needed help your first year? Okay, you were in a rigorous situation and you needed support and scaffolding. If you need it, why wouldn't your students? And so this is a huge part of rigor. We do a disservice when we just expect students to do something more challenging without helping them get there. So this is where you do things like modeling your thinking, showing them samples of work, whether you want them to learn to write a sentence or complete an art project showing light and perspective. You show them multiple samples and talk through almost an analysis of what does this look like? What is good about this? What could be improved? So that they learn to do their own. One of my grad students, fabulous example, she was high school, and her students, in a language arts classroom, her students were struggling with writing conferencing. They were trying to do peer conferences, and honest to goodness, if you've ever tried this, you know that where they start is, oh, I like it. I guess the beginning's good, you know, and that's sort of where they stop. So what she did was she got a group of 4 students that she had the prior year, and she had them model, and she videoed it. And so then with her current students, she showed them the video, and she just showed them the video all the way through. And she had them talk about it. Then they went back, and she would stop at different points and talk them through it. I don't care what grade level student. I don't care if you've got gifted. I don't care if you've got learning disabled. You need to model for students. They need to see what good looks like. I want you to think about what we just did. You know, we're talking about rigor. And you remember that math example I gave you of what high expectations look like? For you, I was showing you what good looks like. And lots of you posted in the group chat, oh, that's a great idea. I now understand. So showing what good looks like is really powerful. Now, I want to show you a specific graphic organizer that I really like for math. If you've got your handout packet, you have a full-size version of this on page 5. So, you know, you can take notes on it. You can always download it again from my website. You've got my website on your handouts there. I should tell you there's over 100 free resources, videos, podcasts, activity sheets for students, articles, just about anything you could ever want. No registration, no cost, and you have copyright permission to use all of them. This is one of the things that's up there. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is designed to be used with math students who are struggling with word problems. Because one of the challenges in word problems is the words get in the way. So this can be used as an anchor chart with younger students. It can be used as a handout. I've had calculus teachers tell me they use this when they're doing something particularly challenging. I've had teachers where they introduce this concept to everyone, but they use it as a handout with particular students who need help. It's available to anyone, but perhaps their special needs students need to use it all the time. So you can use it in a lot of different ways. What was just said about resources? Okay, on my website, which you got in the handout and everything, there you go to free. Okay, it's real easy. Go to free. There's over 100 resources: articles, podcasts, radio show, activity sheets for teachers and for students. You can use any of them. You have copyright permission. You don't have to register. So that's where you get those. Okay, going back to this, let's look at this. First thing they do is they skim the problem for clue words. Then they don't go in depth. They're just skimming it. Okay. Now, what do I know from the problem? What are the given variables? Not what do I know about life. I know that trains do this. Okay, what do I know from the problem? What's the question? Okay. My stepson, when he was in math in middle school, bless his heart, he would so badly want to go skateboarding that he would just rush home, throw together his math homework, and go out and go skateboarding. And part of the time, he just wouldn't bother to read the question. And then when he'd get the answer wrong, it was a challenge for him. So we're going to slow down and read the question. Now what's missing? The missing variable. Okay, steps to solve it. They solve the problem. And now at the end, write a sentence explaining the solution. So we're going to use some academic vocabulary. And you can even add another one with, how do you know it is correct? So this provides the support because what it really does is it breaks down the strategic process. Now, I love what Cheryl just said about it could work for vocabulary too. Laurie, perfect for ELLs, absolutely. You know, this idea, I've given you a math example, but the idea works any subject level, wide variety of students. Any kind of process you have, giving them a graphic organizer, adding the pictures as clues is very helpful. And on the website, there are some other examples. In fact, if you happen to be a high school or middle school Spanish teacher, there's a Spanish one for vocabulary on the website, and it's great. So it really works for all subject areas. Okay, let's move on to the last part, which is demonstration of learning. Okay? Two parts to this. First, in a rigorous classroom, each student demonstrates learning. Okay? Not one student, which is what happens when we call on one at a time. Each student needs to do it. So you want there to be opportunities for each student to respond. Okay? You can do pair shares, thumbs up and thumbs down, 4 corners, whiteboards, clickers, texting you the answers. There's so much technology now, it's just unbelievable. But you really want to have all students have that opportunity. One of the, exit tickets, just so many different ways to do it. One of the things that I'm real passionate about when I work with teachers face-to-face is, you can probably tell, I ask a lot of questions. So one of the things is, I never ask them to respond in a whole group setting unless they have shared in a small group or with a partner. Because what happens is, when I ask a question and I just call on somebody, one, I only get certain students who will answer. Two, I'm asking my students to perform before they practice. And some students are really good at that, and some students aren't. So if I allow them to practice first, then I can get everybody involved. And let's go back to, what do you do with these students who are struggling for whatever reason? Here's how I do that. I ask a question, and I put students in pairs, and let's say I want to call on Jimmy. And Jimmy really, really, really struggles. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Jimmy and Jimmy's partner, Marie. And I'm going to sort of monitor what they're doing. I'm going to listen. If they're on the right track, I'm great. If they're not on the right track, I'm going to sort of help them get there, okay? What I'm going to do at the end of the pair share time is I'm going to tap Jenny on the shoulder, and I'm going to say, Jenny, I really need your help. I need somebody to answer the question, and I want to make sure they're right. And you have the right answer. The two of you came up with the right answer. So if I call on you, can you share that answer that you've got written down right there? Now, what are the chances that if I do that, Jimmy, who's a reluctant, struggling student, is going to share out? See, I've already said he's going to be successful. I've asked him for his help, so he's got some ownership in it. And I'm getting each student involved, particularly those struggling students. Now, the other part is that the assessment needs to reflect high expectations, so that links back. So, you know, in the math, you know, I get that you may need to give 25 computational questions. Well, at a minimum, try to do the misconception piece with several of them. If you can't even do that, pick 5 of the 20, and they have to justify their answer or explain their answer. You know, there are ways to kick it up. Now, one of the challenges is how do you determine what rigor looks like, okay? And this one does get a little tricky, and probably going to step on somebody's toes here, so I apologize in advance. Many teachers use Bloom's taxonomy. I used Bloom's taxonomy as a teacher. The more I have worked with rigor, the more I have struggled with Bloom's taxonomy. And here's why. Bloom's taxonomy, as it is used most often, is very verb dependent. So, for example, create is a high-level skill on Bloom's. So creating is rigorous. Okay? Now, I was in a classroom doing walkthroughs with a principal, and the teacher was very excited because she said, I'm doing a rigorous lesson today. I want you to come visit my classroom. So I go in, and the students are creating. It's definitely rigorous, according to Bloom's. But here's what they were doing. They were creating get well cards for a sick classmate. Now, think about that. And that's not rigorous at all. So it's not just about the verb, it's about what comes after. And so I do find that we struggle a little bit with the notion of what rigor looks like when we only use Bloom's. So what I prefer to use, and I noticed from some of what I saw in the group chat, I really prefer Webb's depth of knowledge. And I prefer that because it focuses on depth and complexity. And I find it to be very, very specific. So I was able to really develop that math piece out of Webb's depth of knowledge. Now, if you Google Webb's depth of knowledge, and some of you probably already are doing that, you're going to find this circle that's divided into 4 parts that has verbs. Okay? Well, then you got the same problem. So I actually contacted Dr. Webb, received a very quick reply. Dr. Webb did not create that circle. He does not endorse it. He does not believe it represents his work, okay? Now, if you're using it, don't freak out, okay? What you want to do is move beyond that. So I have just put a link in the group chat, and that will take you to a 4-page summary of the characteristics of rigor. Now, you've got language arts, math, science, and social studies. And each one has 4 levels. Level 3 is rigorous, okay? 1 and 2 are building. 3 is rigorous. And if you look at those and look at that criteria, I find it is far more helpful to do that. Now, there are also, Evelyn, thank you for reminding me, depth of knowledge questions. There are lots of those online too. Now, y'all probably know this, but you know that online there's some really good stuff and there's some really not so good stuff. So, just be a little cautious. I do like those definitions because they come from Dr. Webb, so I know the credibility of those, and I have found them to be much more descriptive. So, you've got that on there. You could use it as a rubric. You may want to make it a little more student-friendly. I think you could do that. If you do, send me a copy of it so I can see what you did. But I do like that. So, make sure that you click that link. Okay, let's see where we're going to go because we've covered a lot of ground with Rigor. Now, what do you use to measure Rigor? Do you use blooms? Do you use webs? Do you use your state standards as the outside comparison? Do you use something else? Maybe we just sort of do our own thing. So I'm going to give you just a minute to do that because we've definitely got some questions we want to get to, which is good because we pretty much, I want to give you 2 quick ideas, and then we're going to go to questions. So let me give you about 30 more seconds on this poll. And, in fact, what I'm going to do is go ahead and start with one of the instructional ideas because I want to get these wrapped up in time for questions. One is just to begin with a question. Instead of stating what you're going to be teaching today, then you're going to ask a question. Okay, lots of different pieces there, so that's great. Thank you for responding. Okay, so we're going to begin with a question. So here's what I'm going to do. Instead of saying, today we're going to be learning about states, here are some examples of states. Texas, California, Michigan. Instead of doing that, what you do is you ask the students. You say, today we're going to be learning about something. I'm going to give you some examples, see if you can figure it out. Texas, Michigan, California. And you see if they can figure it out. You assess their prior knowledge. You've also upped the rigor a little bit. Here's another one. If you like that, that's 3 alike, by the way. Another one is called red herring, like a red herring in a detective novel. And in that case, you give them 4. And they have to figure out which one does not belong and why. So I might give you Florida, Georgia, California, and Arizona. And if you think about it, I'm looking for the one that doesn't belong and why. And the answer would be Arizona because it does not have a coastline. So that also pushes students to think. Okay, one less strategy, and that's layering meaning real quickly. This is for your struggling students, but I'll give you a tweak for your high students. You actually are going to have a resource for this on page 3 in your handout packet. In layering meaning for students who are struggling, you need them to read an 8th grade article on biomes because you're prepping them for the state test and its standards, and they can't read it. You got 12 who can't read it. Love cognitive rigor matrix for the person who said that. That's another good one just to Google. So I've got 8th graders, 12 of whom cannot read an article on biomes. What I do in layering meaning is I find an easier version of an article on biomes, and I have them read that. Now, that's traditionally where we've stopped, okay? So with layering meaning, what you do is after they read the easier article, you bring them back up to the more challenging article. And because they have read the easier one, they have built background knowledge and they've built vocabulary. So they are more successful with the more challenging article. With gifted, you can flip it around and you can have them read something more challenging after they read the grade level article. So another activity that allows you to increase rigor in terms of text and do that in a way that differentiates for all your students. Okay, we could so talk instruction for another hour, but we cannot do that. So Kelly, I got 7 minutes. What kind of questions do we have that I haven't already hit? Yeah, Nuzella is listed. That list of websites to get you different levels of text is on page 3 of your handouts. Okay, Kelly, what do we have?
Well, I'm going to try to combine a couple of them. You've got a couple of questions about implementing rigor with students with special needs, whether it's auto processing orders or students that can be a little bit more aggressive. So there's not going to be one size fits all for all of these different students, but what are some ways that we can differentiate for students with special needs?
Oh, okay. I need an hour to talk about that. I just do. I mean, that's hard. Actually, what I'm going to do is this. If you're working with special needs students, and I will have to email my publisher and get this link, a book of mine that came out in March, a co-author and I did this, is Rigor in the RTI MTSS classroom. And I have a link, but I've got to get it from my publisher. The book, the entire book, can be read electronically for like 30 days. So you could, read that and get lots of ideas. I don't know that it would hit everything, but it is not an excerpt of the book. It's the book. And it opens up on your screen. I think PDF, you can't save it, you can't print it, but you can read it. So if you want that link, Kelly, I'm going to give this to you as your call. Do you want me to send it to you that can be emailed out, or do you want me to have people email me?
No, I tell you what, why don't you email to us, and then we will blast it out to everybody that on the webinar.
Okay, so we'll take care of that. Kelly's going to make sure I stay on top of that. Okay, what do we have next, Kelly?
Sure. So, the school year has come to an end, and we all know that sometimes toward the end of the year, especially our seniors in high school, go through senioritis. I feel like I still go through senioritis even as a working professional sometimes. But so the question is, the problem I've had is that I've increased rigor in my lessons along with appropriate scaffolding, but when the students don't do well for whatever reason, I'm told to back off the rigor to make sure they pass. I'm teaching mostly high school seniors who start having senioritis early in the year. How do you handle this type of situation?
Okay, I want to do that as two-part. If you're being told by your administration, I don't have a solution for that other than talking to them about why you're doing it and how important it is. I actually worked with a group of high school teachers and on this specific issue, and I do not know where I found it, but I Googled something like students with senioritis and the need to continue learning. I don't know, I Googled something, and I found this great article, and it was a high school student who had written it, and it was all about students whose college admissions had been taken back because they slacked off and their scores, their grades went down. And, they were real clear it doesn't happen with everybody, but it talked about the importance of it. And so I thought that was real interesting. So, there is something like that out there. And, part of it is, I'm going to go back to the motivation piece. You got to tap into students' sense of value, which again is relevance, that you hear a lot about. They need to see what you're doing as relevant more than the grades. And they need to have those activities that they feel successful in and that they like doing. So you've got to beef that up. And you can't totally solve the problem, but if you can get them to buy in that way, you have less of a problem of them disengaging.
Thank you. Got a lot of questions that are popping in very fast, and we're not going to get to all of them.
We have 3 minutes,
I will make
Kelly.
sure. Yeah, I know. I'll make sure that Barbara has copies of all the questions that you guys have submitted. So, in your opinion, what is the best way to get students to buy into rigor?
Not to make a big deal of it. Absolutely not to make a big deal of it. You just start increasing the challenge in the sports. You don't tell them that it's rigorous. You don't use the word rigor. What you do is you make it fun. For example, in any kind of classroom, love this, any kind of classroom with vocabulary, because vocabulary is so boring. When you've taught them the vocabulary, then we usually have them demonstrate understanding, and we typically have them write a sentence with it or write their own definition. Honest to goodness, all that's just bleh. And so what I have them do is write a riddle. Now, a riddle, and there's some parameters you can use with this. And again, I'll tell you what, a lot of these instructional ideas on my website go to articles, lots of articles with these in them. But in this one, they're going to write a riddle. So the riddle has to include the information from the definition, but it has to go beyond it in a real-life application, which is also rigorous, more than just using the basic information. So, for example, I had some 10th grade government students. The teacher sent me the example. Here was their riddle. I'm known as a party school. My mascot changes regularly. popularity doesn't necessarily rule. What am I? And the answer is the Electoral College. Now, so the question becomes, did those students understand the concept of the Electoral College? Absolutely. Did they actually understand it at a higher level than simply writing a definition? Absolutely. So you can loop them into Rigor, just don't make a big deal of it. Do something fun, help them get there, and that's the way you go. I don't think you can separate Rigor from motivation and engagement. I think you've got to do them all three together for students to be successful. Okay, Kelly, I see 30 seconds. I think we've got a problem, right?
I tell you what, I'm gonna sneak one last one in there, Barbara, and then I'll say this to everybody that, I know a lot of people are wondering about, if you missed a poll question and you're trying to download that PDF certificate, you should be able to download that PDF certificate right now, verifying that you're part of this webinar. If the light says you missed a poll question or you weren't on the webinar long enough, no problem. About an hour after this webinar concludes, you're going to get an email from us saying thank you for joining us. At that point, you can actually get back into this webinar, which will then shift to on demand, and then you can answer any poll questions that you may have missed.
Kelly,
right, Barbara,
I skipped the last poll question because of time. I tell you what, Kelly, what if we do this? Because you're going to be able to email people. What if you send me the top 10 questions or 8 questions or whatever you've got? I do written answers and send them to you, and you can send them out to people. What if we do that?
Ooh, I like that idea. I think that's great. Why don't we do that?
Because our time is up, guys.
Yep. And you know what I'm going to do? Barbara, I'm going to say thank you to you in just a second, but I'm also in the group chat pasting the next webinar that's about to go live. For those of you who are joining us live right now, we have Julia Thompson, who is an author, joining us to talk about how to survive and thrive as a new teacher. That's going to start in about 5 minutes, so I encourage you to join us there. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate this. I'm looking at the chat box. People are very excited. Somebody even said they're really excited to head back to school, which is great.
Oh, good.
So I really appreciate your time today on behalf of the AFT.
Well, no problem.
We're happy to have you.
And y'all got my website. You've got my email address, and then we'll answer these questions for you. So y'all have a great rest of the summer and a great start to the school year.